How does it feel? I asked him, to watch your dream mansion reek of pig guts every morning. The look on Victor's face was worth every penny I lost selling my land to that hog processing plant. The wind carried the stench right across his marble patio, the same one he'd built 3 feet from the fence line just to spite me. His perfect white columns gleamed in the sunlight, but even from my porch, I could see him gagging as the low hum of industrial grinders kicked in. Poetic justice doesn't always come clean. Sometimes it smells like rot. It hadn't started this way. A few years back, Victor and I were friends or something like it. We bought neighbouring plots out by Lake Crescent, where the hills met the water in a gentle slope. The kind of land people dream about retiring to. Back then, the air was crisp, the lake mirrored the sky. And I thought we'd grow old tending gardens and waving across the fence on summer evenings. But some men can't stand seeing another man's dream unless they can own it, too. Victor was one of those men. He had old money, family money, and he liked people to know it. I had land 2 acres of prime soil, a modest farmhouse, and a workshop where I built furniture for local fairs. We were neighbours, sure, but we lived in different worlds. Still, he'd come over sometimes, bringing a bottle of something expensive and pretending to be interested in my craft. "You've really got a gift, Mason," he'd say, running his hand over a polished oak table. Imagine what you could do with better tools. He'd always leave that line hanging, like I should be embarrassed about my little lathe and sanders. Things changed when he brought up the mansion. "I'm thinking something grand," he told me one evening, sipping wine on my porch like he owned the view. 2 stories, columns, maybe a pool right by the fence. A proper home for the family I'll have someday. He laughed then, a low sound that didn't fit the empty space beside him. His wife had left him years ago, and his kids barely called. But I didn't say anything. You learn not to poke a man's delusions if he's rich enough to make them real. Construction began the next month. Trucks, noise, and dust invaded every morning at sunrise. My fields turned to mud under the treads of their machines. I complained. Once just once, and Victor smiled that sharp smile of his. "You should have built first, Mason. You can't expect things to stay small forever." That was the moment I knew the friendship was gone. When the mansion finally stood gleaming stone, arched windows, iron gates, it looked like something dragged out of a brochure for rich men trying to look important. He'd planted imported birches along the border, tall enough to cast long shadows over my garden. And as if to drive the point home, he erected a 10-foot wall between our properties. "Privacy," he said, waving as the cement set. "You'll thank me for it." I didn't thank him. I stopped speaking to him altogether. For a while, I tried to ignore it. I worked the soil, fixed my tools, and pretended the noise of his pool parties didn't bleed into my evenings. But the thing about resentment is it grows roots. It was in late autumn when I noticed the sign. A small, discreet for sale posted across the road where a few unused acres lay wild and open. I asked around. Turns out the owner was an old farmer's widow looking to move closer to her daughter. I bought the plot that same week. At the time, I wasn't sure what I'd do with it, only that it would matter someday. That someday came the following spring. It started with an argument, no, an ambush. I woke to the sound of shouting near my gate. Victor was there, with 2 of his contractors, pointing at my side of the fence. "Your shed violates the setback line," he said, waving some papers. "It's encroaching by 2 feet onto my property. I'll need you to move it." The shed had stood there for 12 years. His surveyor, no doubt, had found the error after his new estate was registered. I could have fought it, sure, but I didn't. I just looked at him, at that smug little smirk, and said, "You want me to move it? Fin, I'll move it." That out my maps, Milan did, and as a road, I thought about all the ways a man could fight back without lifting a weapon. And then, as the wind carried over the faint smell of livestock from the next county, I knew. It took months of phone calls, paperwork, and one very helpful lawyer who didn't ask too many questions. By the time the permits cleared, Victor's manchi local magazine vessel, Tekalit. He'd even hosted a charity dinner there, complete with string quartets and imported champagne. The next morning, he woke to surveyors marking the land opposite his driveway. When he asked what was being built, the foreman smiled. "Processing plant. Hog operations. Pretty big one, too. You're lucky you'll be the first to get the view." I was sitting on my porch when he stormed over, red-faced and sweating. You can't be serious. He shouted. You did this, didn't you? I took a slow sip of coffee. Did what? Victor, you sold them the land. I smiled. No, I sold them my land. The one you said was worthless next to your palace. He stood there, trembling, his voice cracking, as he tried to find a threat that mattered. Betrayal denti, not this has it to a watch a drench and Richmgug every morning. The look on Victor's face was worth every penny I lost selling my land to that hog processing plant. The wind carried the stench. Right across his marble patio, the same one he'd built 3 feet from the fence line, just to spite me. His perfect white columns gleamed in the sunlight, but even from my porch, I could see him gagging as the low hum of industrial grinders kicked in. Poetic justice doesn't always come clean. Sometimes it smells like rot. It hadn't started this way. A few years back, Victor and I were friends or something like it. We bought neighboring plots out by Lake Crescent, where the hills met the water in a gentle slope. The kind of land people dream about retiring to. Back then, the air was crisp, the lake mirrored the sky, and I thought we'd grow old tending gardens and waving across the fence on summer evenings. But some men can't stand seeing another man's dream unless they can own it, too. Victor was one of those men. He had money, old money, family money, and he liked people to know it. I had land 2 acres of prime soil, a modest farmhouse, and a workshop where I built furniture for local fairs. We were neighbors, sure, but we lived in different worlds. Still, he'd come over sometimes, bringing a bottle of something expensive and pretending to be interested in my craft. You've really got a gift, Mason, he'd say, running his hand over a polished oak table. Imagine what you could do with better tools. He'd always leave that line hanging, like I should be embarrassed about my little lathe and sanders. Things changed when he brought up the mansion. I'm thinking something grand, he told me one evening, sipping wine on my porch like he owned the view. 2 stories, columns, maybe a pool right by the fence. A proper home for the family I'll have someday. He laughed then, a low sound that didn't fit the empty space beside him. His wife had left him years ago, and his kids barely called, but I didn't say anything. You learn not to poke a man's delusions if he's rich enough to make them real. Construction began the next month. Trucks, noise, and dust invaded every morning at sunrise. My fields turned to mud under the treads of their machines. I complained, just once, and Victor smiled that sharp smile of his. You should have built first, Mason. You can't expect things to stay small forever. That was the moment I knew the friendship was gone. When the mansion finally stood, gleaming stone, arched windows. Iron gates, it looked like something dragged out of a brochure for rich men trying to look important. He'd planted imported birches along the border, tall enough to cast long shadows over my garden. And as if to drive the point home, he erected a 10-foot wall between our properties. Privacy, he sighed, waving as the cement set. You'll thank me for it. I didn't thank him. I stopped speaking to him altogether. For a while, I tried to ignore it. I worked the soil, fixed my tools, and pretended the noise of his pool parties didn't bleed into my evenings. But the thing about resentment is it grows roots. It was in late autumn when I noticed the sign. A small, discreet for sale posted. Across the road, where a few unused acres lay wild and open, I asked around. Turns out the owner was an old farmer's widow looking to move closer to her daughter. I bought the plot that same week. At the time, I wasn't sure what I'd do with it only. That it would matter someday. That someday came the following spring. It started with an argument, no, an ambush. I woke to the sound of shouting near my gate. Victor was there, with 2 of his contractors, pointing at my side of the fence. Your shed violates the setback line, he said, waving some papers. It's encroaching by 2 feet onto my property. I'll need you to move it. The shed had stood there for 12 years. His surveyor, no doubt, had found the error after his new estate was registered. I could have fought it, sure, but I didn't. I just looked at him, at that smug little smirk, and said, you want me to move it? Fine. I'll move it staring up stair maps, Milan deed, and the road. I thought about all the ways a man could fight back without lifting a weapon. And then, as the wind carried over the faint smell of livestock from the next county, I knew. It took months of phone calls, paperwork, and one very helpful lawyer who didn't ask too many questions. Eggs and day. Time the permits cleared. Victor's Mansion local lossing magazine. Decalit. He'd even hosted a charity dinner there, complete with string quartets and imported champagne. The next morning, he woke to surveyors marking the land opposite, his driveway. When he asked what was being built, the foreman smiled. Processing plant. Hog operations. Pretty big. On. You're lucky. You'll be the first to get the view. I was sitting on my porch when he stormed over, red-faced and sweating. You can't be serious. He shouted. You did this, didn't you? I took a slow sip of coffee. Did what? Victor? You sold them the land. I smiled. No, I sold them my land. The one you said was worthless next to your palace. He stood there, trembling, his voice cracking as he tried to find a threat that mattered. Time, because for once, all his money couldn't buy him clean air. When the plant opened, 6 months later, the wind shifted just enough to carry the stink across his estate. The grinding started at dawn, the trucks ran all day, and the flies came in swarms so thick he had to cancel his garden parties. He installed air purifiers, noise barriers, even paid to have a massive wall built higher, thicker, uglier than the first. But it didn't matter. The smell found him, seeping through the cracks, reminding him every day that greed carries a scent all its own. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I still sit out on my porch and watch his mansion through the haze. The lights flicker, the windows stay shut, and I can almost hear the faint echo of him cursing my name. I raise my coffee cup toward the hog plant smokestacks, watch them billow into the sky, and whisper, "Cheers, neighbor." He stopped waving after that summer. The man, who once strutted through his marble corridors like a self-anointed king, now moved like a ghost behind tinted windows. His lawn, once the envy of Crescent Valley, had turned patchy and pale under layers of dust that the factory's exhaust left behind. The pool had gone unused since the first odor incident, the water now covered by a sagging plastic top that flapped against the wind. And every morning, without fail, the trucks would groan down the gravel, road 16-wheelers filled with livestock, squealing and snorting, their smell thick as guilt. I'd watch from my porch, coffee in hand, pretending not to enjoy it, but I did. Oh, I did. Revenge, when done right, doesn't come in a flash, it lingers. It infects the air, just like the stench that haunted Victor's paradise. I'd been patient through every insult, every sneer, every smug remark about progress. Now, progress was eating him alive. The town started talking. Small towns always do. The folks at Mary's Diner said you could smell Victor's mansion from half a mile away, and that he'd called the mayor twice a week trying to shut the plant down. He's threatening to sue the county, Mary told me once, refilling my coffee cup with a wink. Can you imagine? Man builds himself a palace and then throws a tantrum when the real world shows up next door. I smiled into the steam rising from my cup. Can't fight the wind, I said. It blows where it wants, but Victor wasn't done fighting. It started with the letters official-looking envelopes from his lawyer. Claims of environmental violations, noise complaints, zoning breaches. All of them directed not at the plant, but at me. He accused me of colluding, of fraud, of manipulating the county into approving the sale. I kept every letter in a neat and ornament, like trophy. Eliriv showed up. Mason, Sheriff Dalton said, scratching the brim of his hat, "You know, I don't much care for paperwork. But I gotta hand you this." He passed me a thick envelope. The paper smelled like printer ink and arrogance. "Let me guess," I said. "Victor's latest crusade." Dalton chuckled. "You could call it that. He's filed for injunction claims your sale caused emotional distress." I laughed. I couldn't help it. "He's distressed because pigs fart upwind. That's a new one." Dalton grinned. "Can't say I envy you, though. Man's got money. He'll drag this out." I looked past him at the horizon, where the sun bled red through the smokestacks. "That's fine," I said. "I've got time," and I did. The lawsuit made local news, which only made things worse for Victor. Reporters loved the story, a wealthy developer suing a farmer because of hog smell. The coverage wasn't kind. One article even called him the Duke of Stench that once stayed framed in my living room for months. By winter, his mansion had turned into a monument of decay. Mold crept up the stucco where rainwater pooled, and the great fountain he'd installed out front froze into a grotesque sculpture of ice and sludge. The few guests who still visited didn't stay long. I watched one of them, a woman in a white fur coat, step out of her car, wrinkle her nose, and get right back in without even ringing the bell. Word spread that Victor was trying to sell. But no one wanted it. The listing agents came and went, their polished smiles fading, fast once they caught the first whiff of the air. Gorgeous architecture, one said to me, shaking her head. But you can't sell marble wrapped in manure. I nodded politely. Some smells just stick, I said. That spring, I saw him outside for the first time in months. He was standing ankle shirt and cannot hide. Premier almost didn't recognize him. He looked smaller somehow, deflated. When he noticed me watching, he hesitated, then walked toward the fence. Mason, he called, voice hoarse. I didn't move. Please, he said. Can we talk? The word please hit me harder than I expected. This was the same man who once bragged about buying politicians for sport. The same man who told me I should have sold my land years ago because progress waits for no one. Now, he looked like a man begging the tide to turn back. I leaned on the fence. Talk. Then he swallowed hard. You win, all right? Whatever this was about, you win. I can't live like this. That's funny, I said, tilting my head. You told me the same thing once when you built that wall. He sighed, eyes darting toward the factory across the road. They're offering to buy me out. The company, it's not much, but I might take it. I said nothing. He looked down, voice soft. Was it worth it? All this? I let the silence stretch. The distant groan of machinery filled the space between us. Finally, I said, worth is a funny thing. Victor, you measure it and you took mean. I just took it back. He nodded slowly, eyes glassy, then turned and walked away. I didn't see him again for months. When the sale finally went through, I heard the rumors he'd moved to the city, smaller apartment, kept quiet. The mansion stood empty for a while after that, its windows boarded up, its garden wild and overrun. But every time the wind shifted, the smell still found it, wrapping the dead estate in the same reminder that some sins never really wash clean. And me, I stayed. Built myself a new porch swing. Planted a row of sunflowers facing the factory, bright and golden, standing tall, no matter what the air brought. Some nights, when the moon's low and the world feels quiet, I still hear the low rumble of the grinders and think about how strange justice can be. It doesn't come in courts or headlines. Sometimes it comes in the form of a man learning that the world doesn't bend just because he can buy it. And sometimes it smells like pigs. It was nearly 2 years after Victor left that the county came knocking again, but this time the conversation wasn't about lawsuits. The hog plant had expanded, swallowing more of the valley, and with it came jobs, taxes, and, inevitably, politics. The county wanted to rezone part of my land for commercial adjacency, whatever bureaucratic nonsense that meant. I sat across from the zoning officer in my kitchen, a young guy named Brandon who looked too polite for his own good. He laid out the forms, maps, and permits, speaking with the kind of careful tone you use when approaching a sleeping dog. Mr. Holley, he said, the county's offering compensation, a pretty generous amount. But we'd need access to the south portion of your land for road expansion and industrial drainage. I leaned back in my chair, studying the papers. You mean the field by the birches? He nodded. That's my best soil, I said. He shifted in his seat. Yes, sir, I understand. But the expansion, well, it's going to happen one way or another. We'd rather work with you then. Around you, there it was, the subtle threat wrapped in diplomacy. I'd heard it before. Hell, I'd lived through it. But this time, I wasn't the man being cornered. I was the one with leverage. I smiled. Tell them I'll think about it. After he left, I stepped outside, boots crunching on gravel. The wind carried the same thick smell. It always did, though after years of living with it, I'd stopped noticing. Across the road, the hog plant's lights shimmered through the haze, a living monument to spite. That's when I saw a black sedan parked by the old mansion's gate. A figure stood near the entrance, staring up at the decaying facade. I knew that stance, the slight forward lean, the hands in the pockets, the air of a man haunted by something he once owned. Victor. He looked older. Thinner, too, his hair grayer, face worn in ways money couldn't hide. I almost didn't go over, but curiosity is a hard itch to ignore. He turned as I approached, eyes narrowing, as if he wasn't sure I was real. Amazon, he said, voice soft, tired. Didn't think I'd see you again, I replied. He gave a faint laugh. Neither did I, for a moment. Neither of us spoke. The air between us buzzed with flies and faint machinery hum. I thought they tore this place down. I said, finally. They wanted to, he said, gazing up at the cracked windows, but the foundation's too solid. Costs more to demolish than it's worth. Fitting, I said. It's like the smell. Won't go away no matter how much you pay. He gave me a small, almost genuine smile. You always did know how to twist the knife. I learned from the best. He exhaled, shoulders slumping. I didn't come to fight. I came to, I don't know, see. It one last time, maybe. Say goodbye. I studied him for a long moment. There was something different about him, humility, maybe. Or defeat. Hard to tell the difference when a man's pride has been bled dry. Why'd you build it here, Victor? I asked quietly. You could have gone anywhere. You had the money. He looked down at the dirt. Because I wanted to be better than you. The honesty hit harder than I expected. No theatrics, no sugarcoating. Just the plain, pitiful truth. He went on. When we first bought this land, you had something I didn't. You had peace, simplicity. I thought if I built something bigger, something grander, maybe I could feel what you felt, but I never did. All I built was noise. I didn't know what to say to that. So I didn't. We stood there for a while, just listening to the hum of the plant and the crows circling overhead. Then he turned to leave. I'm moving out west, he said. Montana, maybe, wide open air. No neighbors. Sounds nice, I said. He smiled faintly. Don't sell this place, Mason. It suits you. He started back toward the sedan, then stopped halfway and looked over his shoulder. You ever regret it? What you did. I met his eyes. Every damn day, I said. But that doesn't mean I'd undo it. He nodded, as if that made perfect sense. Then climbed into his car and drove off, the dust from his tires curling into the air like ghosts. Act after I left, walked a broken window. Inside, sunlight filtered through gaps in the ceiling, illuminating empty rooms and peeling paint. The grand staircase, once polished and proud, sagged slightly under years of neglect. I remembered the nights I'd heard music drifting from those halls, laughter echoing across the fields. Now, there was only silence. I stood there until dusk, when the hum of the hog plant deepened into its night rhythm, and the first stars began to appear. Then I turned back toward home. Weeks passed. I didn't hear from Victor again. But one day, a letter arrived, no return address, just my name written in neat, careful script. Inside was a short note, asterisk Mason, asterisk asterisk, I've found peace at last. Took me long enough to realize it's not something you can build, only something you make space for. Thank you for teaching me that, even if it was the hard way. Asterisk asterisk V. Asterisk I folded the letter and set it by the box where ID kept his old lawsuits. Funny thing, though when I opened the box, the papers inside smelled faintly of dust and something else. Not hogs, just time. That night, I burned them all. Every letter, every trace of that bitter feud. Watched the ashes rise into the sky, carried away by the same wind that had once brought me revenge. For the first time in years, I felt something close to clean air. But stories like ours don't end easy. Not when the land remembers. Not when men build monuments to their pride and forget that the earth keeps score. Because a month later, I got another knock at the door, this time from the company that owned the plant. They weren't asking to buy my land anymore. They were telling me they already had. The county had approved the eminent domain request while I wasn't looking. And for the first time, I understood what it felt like to be on the other side of the wind. The notice came in a thick envelope, stamped with the county seal, heavy enough to feel like judgment. I'd seen plenty of paper in my life permits, deeds, contracts, but this one felt different. Cold, final. It told me, in words only lawyers could write, that my land was no longer mine. Eminent, dit. For public utility and infrastructure development, the kind of phrase that makes theft sound noble. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the papers, the afternoon light cutting across the wood grain, and for a long time I couldn't bring myself to move. My coffee went cold. The clock ticked, steady and indifferent. Outside, the sound of machinery droned like a heartbeat that wasn't mine anymore. They'd taken everything I'd built, every fence post I'd sunk, every seed I'd pressed into the soil. The hog plant wanted to expand, add more processing units, more storage, more everything. And my land, they said, was the most efficient route. That was the word they used. Efficient. I drove into town that night. Mary's diner was half full, the same mix of farmers, truckers, and factory workers who'd been there for decades. Mary saw me come in and frowned immediately. "You look like a man who's seen a ghost," she said, pouring me a cup before I could even ask. "They're taking it," I said. "All of it." Her hand froze halfway to the sugar jar. "The county?" I nodded. "Jesus, Mason, after all that," I gave a dry laugh. "Yeah, after all that, the regulars had heard, of course." News like that spreads faster than fire in a wheat field. A few offered quiet condolences. One man who drove the hog trucks looked at me with genuine guilt in his eyes. "For what it's worth," he said, "you never deserved it." But the company's got deep pockets. Deeper than sense. I finished my coffee and went home without saying much. That night, I walked the length of my property in the dark. The fields were quiet except for the distant hum of the plant. I could see its floodlights glowing over the ridge like a second sunrise. My boots sank into the soil I'd turned with my own hands, soil that would soon be paved and drained and buried under concrete. Halfway across the field, I stopped by the old oak tree, the one my father had planted the year I was born. It had stood through storms, droughts, and everything in between. I pressed my hand against the bark, rough and cool under my palm, and whispered, "I'm sorry." When dawn came, I drove to the county office. The receptionist barely looked up when I handed her the notice and said I wanted to speak to whoever signed it. 10 minutes later, I was sitting in front of a man in a blue suit who looked like he'd been born behind a desk. "Mr. Holley," he began with a rehearsed smile, "I understand this is difficult. But we followed all legal channels. I'm not here to argue legality," I said, cutting him off. "I just want to hear you say it plain. You're taking my home so pigs can die faster." He blinked, caught off guard. "I wouldn't phrase it that way." "Sir, then how would you phrase it?" He hesitated, tapping his pen. "Progress," he said finally. "Growth for the community." I leaned forward, voice low. "You ever smelled that progress, son?" His pen froze mid-tap. "Didn't think so," I said, standing up. "You tell your bosses something for me. You can buy the dirt, but you can't buy peace. You'll never find it here." I walked out before he could answer. Over the next few weeks, the machines came. Big yellow ones that growled and chewed the earth like it was nothing. They tore down the fence first, then flattened the shed, then dug deep trenches where my garden used to be. The oak tree stood tall through it all until the day a dozer stopped beside it and the operator climbed out, hesitating. "Sir," he said when he saw me watching from the porch. "They said everything goes." I nodded slowly. Everything. When the tree finally fell, the sound was louder than thunder. It echoed through the valley, bouncing off Victor's old mansion like a curse. The day they handed me the final check, I didn't even open it. I didn't want their money. It sat on the counter for weeks, collecting dust. The bank called, the county sent letters, but I couldn't bring myself to cash it. What would I buy? What could replace the land that had shaped me? Then one evening, as I sat on the porch steps watching the sun dip behind the smokestacks, a car pulled up, black sedan. Out stepped a woman in a tailored coat, maybe mid-40s, confident, polished. She introduced herself as Claire Whitman, Executive Counsel for Crescent Valley Processing, the company that had taken everything. "Mr. Holley," she said with a professional smile, "I know this has been a difficult transition." The company wanted to extend a gesture of goodwill. I raised an eyebrow. A gesture. Chantez-moi. An envelope. Inside was a document offering me a job. Community Relations Officer. 6 figures. Benefits. Relocation, if I wanted. "You're respected in this town," she said. "You understand the people here. You could help us bridge the gap." I laughed, actually laughed, the kind that comes from the gut and hurts a little. "You think I'd work for the same folks who stole my land?" Her expression didn't change. "You'd be surprised how often anger turns into opportunity, Mr. Holley. Besides, you know how things work here. The world moves forward. With or without us." I looked past her, at the endless line of factory lights, at the grey smoke curling into the orange sky. "You're right," I said. "It moves, but not always forward." She hesitated, then nodded politely, realizing there was nothing left to say. After she drove off, I sat in the growing dark, listening to the hum of the plant and the distant squeals carried on the wind. The smell was heavier now, thicker, almost alive. I could feel it clinging to my clothes, my skin, my memories. That night, I dreamed of the old days, Victor, and I standing by the lake before it all began, to men with clean hands and bigger hopes. The water had been clear then, the air sweet, and the wind. The wind had carried nothing but the sound of birds. When premier woke, I made a decision. If the world wanted my land, it could have it, but it would remember me. The next morning, I drove to the plant gates with a folder under my arm. Inside were records copies of every correspondence, every environmental violation, every zoning loophole they'd slipped through to expand. I'd kept them all, just in case. I handed them to a local journalist I knew, young guy named Casey, who'd once covered Victor's downfall. "You want a story?" I said. Her swan, 3 Wade Ning pages. "Mason, this could bury them. That's the idea." And as I turned to leave, I caught the wind, shift again carrying the stench of what men call progressant for the first time. I smiled. Because I knew, this time, it wouldn't just stink. It would burn. Casey didn't waste time. By the end of the week, he'd turned my dusty folder of evidence into a front page expose that shook. Valley. Crescent Valley processing under investigation for illegal waste disposal. That was the headline in bold black letters, printed across every newspaper stand from here to the next county. I still remember the sound of that stack of papers hitting Mary's counter when I walked in for coffee that morning, thick, damp from the press, still smelling like fresh ink. And vengeance, Mary whistled low when she saw the headline. "You had something to do with this, didn't you?" I just shrugged and took a sip. Just gave the truth a little air. The article was brutal. Photos, documents, insider quotes. Casey had gone deep. He'd traced waste leaks from the plant's holding tanks directly into the groundwater near the old creek. The same creek that ran behind my property and fed into Lake Crescent. They'd been dumping runoff for years, covering it up with falsified inspection records. By noon, the plant gates were swarmed with cameras, reporters, and inspectors in neon vests. Trucks lined the road, drivers arguing, supervisors shouting into phones. For the first time in years, the hog plant fell silent. The great machine that had devoured my land and Victor's peace. Before me finally stopped to choke on its own greed. That night, I stood on my porch again. It was quiet, eerily so. No trucks, no grinding, no smell. The air was still, the kind of silence that makes you realize how loud life's been until it suddenly isn't. I almost didn't recognize the sound of clean air. The next day, Casey showed up at my place, eyes bright, running on caffeine and adrenaline. "Should have seen the county meeting," he said, waving his notebook. "They're livid, a pest stepping in. Criminal charges might follow." I gave a slow nod. "Good." He hesitated. "They're saying some of the higher-ups knew. And, your name came up too." I looked up from my coffee. "Mine? Yeah. Apparently, you were on the zoning documentation. The sale. They're saying you knew about the expansion's environmental risk when you sold the land." I froze. I hadn't thought of that. Exenterde. Sold my land to the hog company out of spite. Yes, but I hadn't known they'd poison the ground. Still, that didn't matter to reporters or to public opinion. Casey sighed. "It's politics, Mason. They'll drag your name through the mud if it means saving themselves." I stared out the window at what used to be my field now, just flattened dirt and scaffolding. "Let them try," I said. But premier knew what was coming. Within days, the media turned. The same cameras that had painted me as a whistleblower now called me a disgruntled landowner, complicit in environmental negligence. They said I'd sold the land knowing full well what it would become. They weren't wrong, not entirely. I hadn't known the specifics, but I'd wanted to hurt Victor. And in doing so, I'd built the monster that now poisoned the valley. Justice, it turned out, had a way of circling back. The EPA shut down part of the plant pending investigation. Workers were laid off. Families that depended on those jobs started to struggle. Mary told me business at the diner dropped by half. Folks started looking at me differently, less like a man who'd stood up to power, more like the man who'd lit the fuse. One night, I walked into the diner and the room went quiet. Conversations paused mid-sentence. A few men turned back to their plates. Earl, the truck driver, didn't even meet my eyes. I sat at the counter. Mary hesitated before pouring my usual cup. Mason, she said softly, you might want to lay low for a while. People are upset, I said, half smiling. They should be. She shook her head. Doesn't matter. They need someone to blame, and you're close enough. I stared down at my coffee. The dark surface rippling slightly under the hum of the fluorescent lights. They're not wrong, you know, I murmured. I started this. Mary leaned on the counter. Maybe, but you didn't dump the waste. You did not. Lie, you didn't build that damn factory. No, I said, taking a sip. I just gave them the land to do it on. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked the dirt road past the old mansion, now nothing but a silhouette against the moonlight. The hog plant loomed in the distance, dark and silent under investigation. It looked dead, but I numerically died. Teju! Wait, and somewhere deep inside me, beneath the satisfaction and bitterness, a strange guilt began to grow. I'd wanted revenge. I'd wanted Victor to suffer, and he had. But in the end, I'd poisoned more than just his air. I'd poisoned everything we'd built here, the town, the soil, maybe even myself. A week later, the county held another, meeting this one public. Première went. Even though Mary told me not to. The hall was packed. Reporters, townsfolk, inspectors, angry faces everywhere. When the board called my name, I stood. The room went quiet. Mason Holley, the chairwoman said, you are listed as the former owner of the land on which Crescent Valley Processing now operates. We'd like to ask if you had knowledge of any potential environmental impacts prior to the sale. Every eye in the room was on me. I took a deep breath. No, I said. I didn't know what they do, but I knew what they were capable of. A murmur spread through the crowd. I sold them that land to hurt a man who wronged me. I continued. I didn't think about what it would do to the rest of us, to the water, to this town. That's on me. Silence. Then someone shouted, so you admit it. I admit I was angry, I said. And that anger blinded me. You can call it revenge, or justice, or whatever you want, but it was rot. The kind that starts small and spreads until it eats everything. No one spoke for a long time after that. When I left the hall, the sun was setting. The air smelled faintly of smoke, and damp soiled the first clean. Wind I'd fell in years. I walked past the old oak stump, the empty field, and the fence line where it had all begun. Somewhere in the distance, a truck engine started up again. The plant was coming back to life, but I didn't stop walking. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to fight the wind anymore. I was just letting it carry me wherever it wanted to. Go, and maybe, just maybe, that was the only kind of peace left for a man like me. The wind carried dust instead of smell now. The county had forced the plant to retrofit its waste systems and install scrubbers, and though the air was cleaner, it still felt wrong. Hollow, kind of quiet, that phone month pas said. The headlines moved on. Crescent Valley became just another rural cautionary Taylor case study for ethics students and environmental conferences. I was a ghost in my own hometown, a reminder of the feud that had stained the valley. I kept to myself. Sold what tools I could, rented a small cabin out by the northern ridge far enough that I couldn't hear the factory's hum, but close enough that I could still see its smokestacks on the horizon. They looked smaller from a distance, almost harmless. One evening in late autumn, I drove back toward the lake, not really knowing why. Maybe I wanted to see what was left of the old mansion, or maybe I just wanted to remember. Road had changed, fresh pavement, new signage, industrial lighting, where there used to be stars. The mansion was still there, barely. The roof had caved in, ivy crawling up its sides, windows black and empty. I parked the truck and sat in silence. The moonlight washed over the cracked columns and shattered marble, turning everything silver. It looked less like a house now, and more like a tomb. I got out, walked through the rusted gate, and made my way to the front steps. The wind pushed through the broken windows, whistling like something alive. I sat on the steps where Victor once bragged about pool parties and garden views. Now it was all dirt and ruin. That's when I saw the lights. Headlights, coming slow down the road, weaving through the mist. A black SUV. It stopped a few yards away, and a man stepped out, silhouetted against the beams. He walked with purpose, steady, deliberate. When he got close enough, I saw his face. Casey, the reporter. Mason, he said, shoving his hands into his coat pockets. I thought I'd find you here. I smiled faintly. You sure you should be talking to a man like me? Won't make for a good headline. He chuckled. There are no more headlines. Not about this. He stood beside me, looking up at the ruined mansion. Hard to believe this was once the crown jewel of the valley. Hard to believe any of it ever happened, I said. He nodded. They shut the plant down for good. Lestement. EPA hit them with fines too big to recover from. The land's condemned now. Groundwater's poisoned. Town's drying up. I turned to look at him. So it ends where it began, nothing but empty land. Not exactly, he said. There's talk of restoring it. Some environmental group wants to buy the property, clean it up, turn it into a nature reserve. I couldn't help but laugh, though there wasn't much humor in it. A nature reserve? On top of pig blood and rot, yeah, Casey said, half smiling. Guess that's what redemption looks like nowadays. We stood there in silence for a long time, the wind moving through the ruins, carrying echoes of the past. You ever hear from him? I asked. Victor. Casey shook his head. No, rumor is he died last winter. Irata? Alone, somewhere in Wyoming. The name hit like a dull hammer against the inside of my skull. I didn't flinch, but I felt it. For a moment, I saw him as he'd been standing tall in his white shirt, grinning like a man who believed he could tame the world. Then I saw the last version of him, tired, hollow, standing by that same fence line, admitting the truth. I stared at the cracked steps under my boots. He got what he wanted, I said quietly. A place with no neighbors. Casey didn't reply. He just nodded, respectful. Before I left, he envelope. Found this in the county archives. Thought you might want it. I opened it when he drove off. Inside was a photograph, an old one. Maître Victor s'y bought the land. He was laughing, hand on my shoulder. I was younger, smiling in that stupid, innocent way men do before they know what life's going to take from them. On the back, someone had written in fading ink, asterisk Lake Crescent Tower, new beginning. Asterisk, I sat there until dawn. The photo clutched in my hand, the cold creeping into my bones. When the first light broke over the ridge, I stood and walked to the water. The lake was smaller now, choked at the edges by runoff and reeds, but it still held a kind of fragile beauty. The reflection of the rising sun shimmered across the surface, gold and silver, like a wound healing over. I knelt, pressed the photo to my lips, and let it fall into the water. It drifted for a moment, then sank. For a while, I just watched the ripples fade. The past doesn't vanish. Seeps into soil, into water, into the bones of the land itself. But maybe that's all right. Maybe some scars are meant to stay, to remind whoever comes next that pride has a price. And that piece isn't something you take, it's something you protect. I walked back to my truck as the valley woke behind me. Birds, faint and cautious, began to sing again. The air smelled clean. For the first time in years, I didn't think of revenge or loss or justice. I thought of quiet. And for a man like me, that was enough. By the following spring, the valley began to change again, but not in the ways I expected. The old hog plant, the symbol of everything I'd come to hate, was being dismantled piece by piece. The new environmental foundation that bought it had sent in teams wearing white suits and respirators, digging into the earth like archaeologists unearthing a tragedy. Huge containers of soil were hauled away every day, loaded onto trucks and shipped off for treatment. From the ridge where I lived now, I could see the transformation, like a slow, deliberate kind of penance. The smoke was gone. The hum of machinery, gone too. All that remained was wind, birds, and the slow grind of cranes undoing what men had built in arrogance. Sometimes I'd drive down and watch from a distance. Nobody paid me much attention anymore, and I liked it that way. I'd park near what used to be the main gate and just sit. there with the windows down, breathing the air that finally smelled like nothing. One afternoon, a woman from the foundation approached me. She was young, maybe early 30s, wearing a Vestmark Crescent restoration project. Her hair was tied back, face streaked with dust and sunlight. "Mr. Holley?" she asked. "Used to be," I said. "Now, it's just Mason." She smiled a little. "Iwatol, you might show up here. I'm Amelia, project coordinator." I nodded toward the torn-up ground. "You've got quite the job ahead of you." She crouched beside a patch of soil, digging her gloved hand in. "We've seen worse." Half smiling. "Not people." She looked at me thoughtfully, then stood. "I don't believe that people heal slower. Maybe. But they do." We stood there quietly for a while, watching the cranes lift rusted metal beams from the wreckage. "Why'd you come back?" she asked. I took a long breath. "Because this place remembers me. And I owe it something." Her eyes softened. "You can still help, you know. We're recruiting locals people who understand the land, who remember what it was before all. This," I laughed lightly, "you'd want me. The man who sold it in the first place." Amelia tilted her head. "Seems to me you understand better than anyone why it shouldn't be." Lost again. That line stayed with me for days. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I walked the fields where my home once stood. The soil was scarred, uneven, but small blades of green had started to push through the dirt. Grass, wildflowers, things that had waited years to return. A few weeks later, I showed up at the project office, signed my name on the volunteer list, and started work the next morning. It wasn't glamorous. We cleared debris, moved old pipes, laid down grass seed, but it felt right. The kind of work that doesn't shout, it just breathes. I worked alongside people who didn't know the history, who didn't look at me like a ghost. To them, I was just another pair of hands. Every day, the land changed a little more. The old processing pit was filled in, the runoff channels blocked. We planted rows of willow, trees along the creek fast growing, strong enough to hold the soil. The lake, once choked with sludge, began to clear again, slowly. One evening, Amelia found me sitting on the hill, overlooking the site. The sun was setting behind the ridge, painting the valley gold. "It's starting to look alive again," she said. "It is alive," I replied. "Always was." We just stopped listening. She sat beside me, brushing dirt from her gloves. "There's a ceremony next month," she said. "We're officially dedicating it as protected land. The board wants someone local to speak. Someone who knows the story." I shook my head. "No one wants to hear from me." "I do," she said softly, "and maybe others will too. People need to understand what this cost. What it means to start over." I looked out at the trees, at the slow, deliberate rebirth happening where greed once stood. "I'll think about it," I said. Wednesday came. I almost didn't go. But something in my the same part that once burned for revenge, now quieted by time, pushed me forward. The ceremony was small. A few dozen people, local officials, workers, families. A wooden sign unveiled at the edge of the new reserve. *** Crescent Valley, Reclamation, Site ***. When Amelia called my name, I felt every eye turn toward me. The same people who once whispered blame now watched in silence as I stepped up to the podium. I had no speech prepared, just the truth. "I used to think land was something you could own," I began. "That you could. Stake it, fence it, sell it, ruin it, and it would still somehow belong to you. But I was wrong. The land owns us. It remembers every step, every scar, every drop of pride we bleed into it." The wind picked up, rustling through the young trees behind me. I tried to use this place to hurt someone. And in doing so, I hurt all of us. But the thing about land, about life, is that it forgives slower than we want and stronger than we deserve. I looked toward the horizon, where the last remnants of the factory had been cleared. "This valley will heal," I said. "It needed us to stop trying to conquer it and start learning to belong again." When I stepped down, no one clapped. They didn't need to. Silence can be its own kind of grace. Afterward, Amelia walked up beside me, eyes bright. "You did good," she said. "Première smiled." "No, the land did." We stood there as the sun dipped low, the first chorus of frogs croaking from the creek, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a man haunted by what he'd done. I felt like part of something trying, quietly, to grow again. The wind shifted then, carrying not the stench of death, but the faint, sweet smell of wildflowers. It rolled across the valley, soft and alive, wrapping the scars in something that almost felt like forgiveness. And for the first time in a long, long while, I breathed deep and didn't flinch. Summer settled over Crescent Valley like a slow exhale. The new grass took hold, rippling green where the earth had once been grey and hard. Dragonflies skimmed the surface of the creek again, and when the wind came down off the hills it smelled of water and heat and the faint sweetness of clover. I kept working with the restoration crew. We built paths of packed earth that followed the old property lines and set benches at the high points where you could see the whole valley. Sometimes school groups came to plant seedlings. They'd ask the usual questions: why the land had been poisoned, how it could heal, and Amelia would explain. About balance and stewardship. When they asked about the ruins by the lake, she'd nod to me. "That's Mason," she'd say. "He remembers how it used to be." I'd tell them about the oak tree and the way the soil smelled after rain, about the lake before the plant and the mornings when mist clung to the grass. I never told them about Victor or revenge or the stench that once ruled this place. Some lessons, I figured, didn't need to be passed down in words. Bilatogus wildflowering foundation. Pure plaster. Yellow, coreopsis, a handful of white blooms I didn't recognize. Amelia said it was nature reclaiming space. I like to think it was forgiveness finding its way through stone. One afternoon, she came over with a folder tucked under her arm. "End of phase report," she said. "We're officially done with the first restoration cycle. The land's stable." I wiped the sweat from my brow and leaned on my shovel. Didn't think I'd live to see it. She smiled. "There's another thing. The board wants to name this section of the reserve after you." I froze. "After me." "No, that's not Mason," she interrupted, eyes firm but kind. "This valley was shaped by what happened here, good and bad. We can't erase that. But we can honor the truth of it. You helped bring it back." I looked out at the field, the sunlight dancing over the grass. "Name it after the lake," I said finally. "After something that was here before any of us." She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "All right. Lake Crescent Meadow it is." That night, I walked down to the water alone. The moon was rising, round and pale, and the surface of the lake shimmered like glass. I sat at the edge where the soil met the stones. And for a while I just listened, the slow lap of waves, the whisper of reeds, the sound of life quietly returning. A pair of herons lifted off from the far bank, wings beating against the dusk. Their reflection followed them across the water until it vanished into the sky. I thought of Victor again, not as he was at the end, bitter and broken, but the first day we'd stood here. Boots in the dirt, talking about the future, like we could carve it with our hands. I remembered his laugh, sharp and careless, and the way the wind had carried it over the lake. For the first time in years, the memory didn't sting. It just existed. I pulled a small wooden carving from my pocket. A heron, roughly shaped, the last piece I'd made in my old workshop before the bulldozers came. I set it on a stone and let the water creep up and take it. It floated a moment, then drifted away. "Goodbye, neighbor," I whispered. The next morning, I started rebuilding. My workshop not where it once stood, but higher on the ridge, overlooking the new meadow. The barn, Sandetsmoot, Batrubi. When I finished, I opened all the windows so the wind could move through freely. Visitors began to stop by, sometimes locals, hikers, even tourists from the city. They'd ask about the valley, about the restoration, about the story. I'd tell them what I could, never embellishing, never hiding. I'd show them how the soil crumbled soft in your hand now, how the air carried the scent of rain instead of waste. Amelia came often, bringing maps and plans. For the next phase, new plantings, a visitor center, maybe even guided trails. Each time she left, I'd watch her walk across the field, her boots leaving, shallow prints that the wind erased within minutes. Seasons rolled by. The wildflowers multiplied, trees grew tall enough to cast real shade, and the creek carved a clean line of silver through the grass. One autumn evening, I sat outside the workshop as the sun sank low, its reflection spilling across the meadow like fire. The air was cool, sharp, alive. I could hear the frogs starting their slow chorus by the lake. For the first time in decades, the valley smelled like home. And as the light faded, I thought about everything this place had been about: pride, anger, loss, and what came after. It wasn't redemption, exactly. Redemption implies you can undo something, and I knew better. No, this was endurance. The kind that lives in the soil, waiting for a chance to breathe again. I closed my eyes, listening to the wind moving through the willows, and let it carry me the way it always had, steady, unbroken, and at last, clean. Winter came softly that year. The frost spread over Crescent Valley like a veil, turning every blade of grass silver, every branch into glass. From the ridge, I could see the meadows sleeping under the pale morning light, the creek threading through the snow like a line of dark ink. The land was quiet again, not dead, not ruined, just resting. Healing has its own silence. I spent most mornings in the workshop. The scent of cedar and linseed oil filled the air as I carved small pieces, birds, branches, little fragments of the world that had found its way back to life here. The sound of my knife against wood had become a rhythm of peace. Steady and patient. Sometimes Amelia would visit, dropping by with thermoses of coffee and news from the foundation. She said people were coming from all over to walk the reserve now. Families, photographers, school trips. Some came just to sit in the quiet. You know, she said one morning, warming her hands on her cup, there's a spot down by the lake we've been clearing for a memorial. Nothing fancy. Just a plaque to mark how far the land has come. I nodded. It deserves that much. She looked at me for a long moment. You do too. Mason. I smiled faintly. The land's the story now. I was just the fool who helped it find its ending. That night, after she left, I walked down the slope to the meadow. The snow crunched beneath my boots, the air sharp with cold. Above me, the sky was clear stars so bright they made the world below seem smaller, gentler. The lake lay still, frozen at the edges, the surface catching the faint glow of moonlight. I stopped at the place where the oak tree had once stood. The stump was gone now, replaced by a young sapling, bare branches stretching upward, fragile but certain. I crouched down and brushed the snow from its roots. Grow strong, I whispered. And remember everything. The wind stirred, soft and familiar. I could almost hear echoes in it, the laughter from long ago, the rumble of machines, the low hum of all the lives that had moved through this valley. It didn't sound like sorrow anymore. It sounded like memory. When spring returned, so did the color. The meadow erupted in green again. The willows unfurled new leaves, and the sapling by the lake grew thicker, prouder. The air stayed clean, the water clear enough to reflect the clouds. The dedication ceremony was small, just like the one before. This time, I stood in the crowd, not at the front. Amelia spoke, and when she mentioned my name, a few heads turned, a few people smiled. I nodded, but said nothing. I didn't need to. Afterward, I walked the path that wound down toward the lake. The plaque had been set into a smooth stone by the water's edge. It read, Crescent Valley Reserve restored by many hands, forgiven by the earth itself. I stood there for a long while, reading the words again and again. The reflection of the sky shimmered on the surface of the lake, endless and calm. And for the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt since before Victor built his mansion, before the noise, the greed, the smell, and the loss. I felt at peace. Not the peace that erases what's gone before, but the kind that grows out of it, the kind that comes when you finally stop fighting the wind and let it carry you home. As I turned to leave, I looked back once more. The sapling swayed gently in the breeze, its leaves whispering like a secret too old for words. And I thought, maybe this is what forgiveness really looks like. Not the mansion, not the ruin, not even the revenge. Just the land alive again, breathing, remembering, enduring, and I walked away with the wind at my back. The valley whispering softly behind me, its story finally told.